My name is Malcolm, and this story happened about a year ago, back when my wife and I purchased our first home. We had made the long drive from Ohio to Oklahoma, and my wife Jane and I were exhausted. We got to the house around 9 p.m. and made a makeshift bed on our couch that the movers had already brought a couple of days prior. Once my head hit the pillow, I was out, but my wife complained the next morning that she couldn't sleep, and that she kept hearing noises come from the basement. Given it was an old house, and only the top half was somewhat furnished, I told her that she was probably just hearing the house settle, and she seemed to accept that. A couple of days into living there, we got a visit from one of our neighbors, Martha. We had met her a couple of times before on our visit to the house. We talked with her for a little bit, her asking how the move was. She then asked something that stopped me in my tracks. She asked what I had been working on outside last night, as she had seen me walking back and forth on the side of the house with a flashlight around midnight. Almost the exact same time my wife and I, or at least I, went to bed. Confused and equally concerned, I politely told her that it wasn't me, and that Jane and I had been in the house the entire night. Martha paused for a second, her eyes narrowing, and said something under her breath I didn't catch. Looking over at my wife, I could tell we were all equally uncomfortable, so we excused ourselves, and Martha went back to her house. We had just moved in. Our neighborhood was pretty far from the nearest town, and setting any appointments to get any cameras would take time, but was possible. We had talked to Martha around 4 p.m., and now the sun was setting. I started to feel a tiny sense of dread, considering that there was an unknown man walking around our house at night. I stayed up a little longer that night knowing that I would regret it, but I felt like our safety was at risk. And I came to grips with the fact that I might have to fend off an intruder. All the doors and windows were locked and up to date. We made sure to replace each and every one before we moved in. So that was an extra layer of safety. I kept 2 baseball bats beside the sofa and waited. I stayed up until midnight, around the time Martha said she saw whoever this was walking around. The only thing I heard that night were a couple of bumps from the basement, and when I went down to check, I didn't see anything. The next day, I went over to Martha's to ask her a little bit more about what she had seen that night. She said that when she thought back to that night again, she noticed that the man was visibly taller than I was. I'm about 5'7", but the man she described was 6'2", 6'3" at best. She said she had gone outside to sit on her porch because she couldn't sleep, and when she looked over at our house, saw whoever it was. She said the pattern that they were moving looked as if they were looking for something. Concerned now that I had left my wife alone, I thanked her and hurried back. Thankfully, when I got there, Jane was fine, starting to unpack the second floor. Our house had a first and second floor, including a pretty decent-sized basement. We had a pretty long staircase leading up to the second floor, so I took on the task of loading and unloading the boxes up and down the stairs. The top floor was much bigger than the bottom floor. As soon as you reached up the stairs, there was a long hallway that stretched out straight in front of you and curved to the left and to the right, rooms big and small alike lining the hall. I started sitting most of the boxes in the first room to the left, since it was the closest and I didn't have to bring them that far. We had been unpacking for 30 minutes or so when I heard the doorbell ring. Since my wife sort of cornered herself in the room with boxes, I made my way downstairs to answer the door. Thankfully, it was for the internet. I let him in and showed him where I wanted our routers to go. His name was James. I let him into the room that was going to be my office, and he started setting up, telling me everything he had to do and how long it would take. I talked to him for a while periodically, hearing my wife bump around upstairs. He excused himself, saying he had to go get something out of his car, so I walked back out to see my wife laying on the couch, asleep. I stared over at her for a second until my eyes flickered towards the staircase, where I was still hearing the bumping. I yelled, "Hey!" really loudly and booked it up the stairs. As I got to the middle of the staircase, the noise had stopped, and when I hit the landing, I couldn't hear anything. A few feet away from the stairs were these weirdly shaped prints on the floor, Some were very clear footprints, and others, I wasn't sure what I was looking at. The footprints were huge, though. A size 12. There was a mixture of mud and what looked like sand. A man with his feet as big as this wouldn't have been able to get away as quickly, and I was pretty fast. Now, how quickly I was running, I would have heard something, and I didn't hear anyone running away, so whoever this was still here. I ran back and forth checking every room. Most of the rooms had windows, but the only real exit was the staircase. Once I checked all the rooms, I ran back down the stairs to my wife, who had asked me what was wrong. My yell had woken her up. James had come out looking concerned, and I asked him if he saw anyone, and he said no. So I was forced to call the police. Since there was no one there, they took a report of it, but it felt like they really didn't take it seriously. They tried to explain it away, that when we were moving up and down the stairs, it happened to be my footprints, but I was clearly wearing slides and not boots, and my wife had baby feet. I also tried to point out to them that the footprints weren't there when my wife and I had first gone up there, also mentioning the fact that someone had been wandering around outside our house a night prior. But they said because no one was found that they really couldn't do anything, unless they returned, which made Jane's face grow cold. They recommended us setting up security cameras and left. It pissed me off that they couldn't do anything, considering that we had evidence of someone being in the house. James felt really bad, but recommended his brother could come out and help us set up our security cameras. He told us it would be an extra fee, but given what had just happened, I didn't care. The rest of that day consisted of his brother Jeff coming out and helping us set up cameras, not only on the outside, but on the inside as well. Call it overkill if you want to, but I knew something wasn't right, and I was going to make sure I protected my home and my wife at any cost. Now, it cost an arm and a leg, but it made us feel safe. Before he left, I downloaded the app for our cameras so that I could see every corner of my house. My wife didn't like it at first because you could pretty much see us in every room except for the bathroom. But I told her once we had the house fully furnished and I was able to purchase a firearm, we'd take the ones down at least in the house. Because the living room was so wide and spacious, we slept in our bedroom. I wanted to make sure that we had a door that could lock. Nothing happened for a couple weeks after, and just when I was starting to feel like everything was okay, something else happened. My wife, who had sprained her ankle coming down the steps, had a hard time moving around for a while, but I tried to take care of her as best as I could. I set up a little station for her to be able to sew and watch TV back in the living room. She needed me to go into town for groceries, so before I left, I made sure that everything was secure and that she had access to all the cameras. It was only a 30-minute drive, but still. I picked up everything that I needed and made my way back home. Now, I'm a one-trip kind of guy, so I grabbed all the groceries, mentally kicking myself because I had to reach for my key that was in my back pants pocket, when I realized that the front door was open. My heart started beating rapidly. I dropped all the groceries and rushed to the door, and standing a few feet away from me was a random guy. He had really big curly brown hair with a scruffy beard. And when he saw me, he put his hands up. Before he could say anything, I decked him, hitting him over and over, yelling expletives I won't repeat here. In the middle of me beating this guy, I felt a grip on my arm as I heard my wife yell for me to stop. Where she came from, I don't know. I didn't hear her come up on me, but I asked her if she was okay. While holding the guy still at arm's length, she told me what happened. She was sleeping on the couch when she heard something at the door. To her, it sounded like an animal, a cat, she thought. So she got up and went to the door, opening it, but didn't see anything. Just as she closed the door, she started to hear a bunch of random noises come from the basement. She said it sounded like a mixture of muffled voices and periodic bangs. She was convinced that somebody had gotten in the house. So as quickly as she could, she went back to the couch, turning on her phone and looking at all the cameras, forgetting to lock the door in the process. But she didn't see anyone. We had 2 cameras down in the basement, both reaching every corner. She scanned the cameras for a minute longer when she saw something hit the first camera in the basement. She screamed instinctively, and the camera went off, but the other one didn't. From closer inspection, she saw a hulking figure in all black standing in the far back corner of the basement. Before she could move, she heard footsteps coming up the driveway. So she went and hid in the office, figuring if whoever it was got in the house, she could hopefully make it out the front door without them knowing. This happened in a span of 10 minutes. I luckily had gotten there almost directly after. I looked down at the guy and he put his hands up again and pleaded to let him talk. I told him he didn't have a long time before I reported him to the police. He proceeded to tell us that he lived the door down from us. While he was outside checking his mail, he heard my wife scream and came to investigate, worried because he didn't hear anything after. I let go of him and immediately felt bad. He stood up and apologized, saying he didn't mean any harm to her, and that his name was Brandon, and that he had been seeing some strange things around the house for days. Looking back on the night when Martha said she saw someone, it was Brandon. About 10 minutes before Martha came out of her house, Brandon was already outside. He stepped out to smoke a cigarette when he saw something standing in the bushes off to the right of our house. Its back was to him, but he could clearly see that this thing was huge. Taller than him, by far. It was broad-shouldered but lanky. Its head he couldn't quite make out. He watched it for a moment, sensing something was wrong, when he saw it crouch, its head silhouette now visible, small with big ears and a pointy nose. He watched it slink down lower where he couldn't see it, and then watched it come into view again, this time crawling on all fours at an ungodly speed directly towards our house. It rounded the corner and disappeared. Without thinking, he grabbed a flashlight and ran after it, hearing strange noises but couldn't see anything. He only had one end of the house to cover. This is where Martha spotted him. Suddenly realizing how it looked, and without saying anything, he went back to his house. He had planned to come over and tell us what he saw, but didn't know when was the right time. Given what he saw, he didn't think we would believe him. We helped him clean himself up, me apologizing profusely. I gave him our number and asked him to call if he saw anything else. After that, my wife and I sat in our living room, dumbfounded and afraid. And this is where the story ends. My wife and I, who have lived here now, are terrified. Any movements, any bump, puts us both in high alert. We're not sure what we're facing, but from what Brandon described, it can't be good. My name is Katie, and this isn't the first time my family has told one of our stories on this channel. My sister-in-law, Shanice, wrote in before about the house I share with my husband. She wrote of her experience, and now I'm here to tell mine. Specifically in my first experience with our new home. My husband Daniel and I purchased our home in 2021. It is a lovely 3-story home with a large but beautiful front and backyard. It's mostly secluded, so we don't have a lot of neighbors. It was my fairy tale home, or so I thought. Sometimes when you really want something to work, you ignore all the things that are wrong, that are directly in your face. We had just moved in, the house fully furnished and decorated, and we made sure that that was a priority before we fully moved in. So my husband and I began all of the technical work that you have to do with your new home. Getting internet, minor renovations, switching addresses, securing the house, those sort of things. This day, I was sitting in our library on the computer. As you walked into our library, on the back wall was a row of library shelves lined with books. and a couple of feet in front of that was our desk. To the right of the desk were 4 very large bay windows, and it was lightly decorated here and there. To the left of the desk was a mid-sized closet that we kept when guests came over to hang coats and luggage. Daniel had left on some errand, so I was at home alone. I was clicking away at the computer when I heard a noise come from the closet. It was a light scratching. I paused, waiting to hear any other noise, but didn't, so I resumed working. I worked for about an hour or so longer, and because I'd been staring so hard at my computer screen, I lifted my eyes up for a second and scanned the room, getting my eyes to readjust to the lighting, when I noticed that the closet door was now open. I remember staring at it for the longest time, because I know the first time I heard the noise and I looked, the door was closed. It had one of those doorknobs where you had to pull down on it to pull it open. So I sat there, trying to remember if I had left it open and just forgot. But I got an eerie chill and decided to leave the room. When Daniel came home that night, I told him what happened, and he told me that I could be forgetful sometimes and that it was nothing to worry about. On another separate occasion, I was back in the office. My sister had come over to see the house, and I had put her jacket and shoes in the closet, leaving it open, because her husband was still getting their bags out the car. I had shown her around the library before she excused herself to go to the bathroom. I was looking out one of the windows, admiring the view, when I heard a light scraping sound. I stopped short and listened, trying to make out the sound that I was hearing. I could see Daniel and my sister's husband Aaron unloading the bags, and I knew where my sister was. I could hear them down from where I was at in the house, but none of the noises matched up to them. I turned slightly and found where the noise was coming from. The closet. I peered in as I watched my sister's jacket swaying back and forth, like something had knocked against it. But the way that it was swaying wasn't normal. You know how you go into your closet and pick something out and your clothes move slightly because you've knocked against them? This was totally different. Her jacket looked as if someone was deliberately pushing and pulling it back and forth. The movement was not right, and I stood frozen. I felt my anxiety rise, and I said to myself quietly, "That's enough." The jacket, now still swaying in its weird way, stopped dead still, and then was slung all the way to the left of the closet out of view. I heard the noise it made as it knocked into the other clothes, and the scraping sound it made on the metal bar. I screamed and ran out of the room, calling for my husband. My family tried calming me down when I told them what happened. My husband, obviously skeptical again, told me that I was just tired, and maybe the stress of moving into the house had gotten to me. At this point, I was pissed and visibly angry with him. I knew exactly what I saw. I was not prone to hallucinations, tired or not. How the jacket moved and the amount of force, the amount of unknown force that it took to move that jacket was frightening. It was very clear to me what I was experiencing, but my husband simply did not want to hear it. My sister believed me, thankfully, and I guess Aaron didn't want anything to do with it. I felt bad because that was their first real experience in our house, me losing my mind over something that I only saw. But I wasn't going to be quiet about it. The rest of the time my sister was there, we tried to have a good time, and we did. And I had almost forgot about everything up until they left. I had to retrieve her jacket from that closet. So I asked her to come with me. I reached for her jacket, quickly snatching it and pulling it back down the other way, and sort of haphazardly throwing it at her because I was so scared. She laughed at me and told me that I was being a wimp. And I guess to prove to me that she was less of a scaredy cat, she stepped into the closet and squeezed all the way to the back wall of the closet. I didn't like her being in there, and she was too quiet for my liking, so I yelled for her to come out. She didn't answer me for a few seconds, and then she slowly walked out, which creeped me out even more. I asked her what was wrong, and she told me that there were multiple scratch marks on the back closet wall. I knew every nook and cranny of my home. I had done all the decorating, all the repainting, and remodeling to it. There wasn't a part of my home that I didn't know what it looked like, or what state it was, and it caught me completely off guard. There was no way I would have overlooked such a thing, and when I got up the courage to look into the closet, I saw exactly what she meant. They were all over the wall from different directions. Without a word, I went to find my husband. This was clear evidence that something was wrong. The library was the first thing we had worked on in the house, and the closet was the first thing to be remodeled. There shouldn't have been any form of scratch marks at all. When I showed him, he first claimed that it could have been a rodent of some kind that was doing all the scratches, but these were long. If it was an animal, it had to be a big one. But as I say again, I knew every inch of my home. And even if an animal did happen to get in, there was no access in that closet where it could have came from, and we spent most of our time around that time on the bottom floor. It just seemed so far-fetched to me. After my sister and her husband left, my husband and I got into a pretty rough argument. We didn't wind up getting anywhere, and in my anger I told him he had to sleep upstairs. Now, to be fair, even though I wasn't happy about the things that had gone on, this was the only moment that I was happy something happened. Because I had a hard time sleeping without him, halfway through the night he came to get me, apologizing for the argument, but not about the fact that he still did not believe me. At this point, I was tired, so I told him that I just wanted to go to bed. He led me to our bedroom, and as soon as I got in bed, I was ready to clonk out. But before I did, I called out to him to check and make sure all the doors were locked on the ground floor. I guess after he was done with the ground floor, he got paranoid for a reason he still won't give to me, and began checking all the windows and doors on every level. When he got back down to the ground floor, rearing around and walking down the steps, he saw a black tall figure walking out our sliding door. His screaming woke me up. I scrambled to get up, running still half asleep, yelling his name. He said he had just seen the person's back as they walked out and ran after them, but that area of the house was gated, and he didn't see anyone. He also failed to mention that the figure that he saw didn't really look like a person, but more so a shadow. And he didn't see it reach for the door. It just slid open before it stepped out. Now, to me, that's more than enough reason to believe the craziness that had been happening in our house. But you all don't know my husband. When I found him, he didn't say anything about it. He just told me to go back to bed and that he'd be up there soon. But he stayed up all night. I could tell by his eyes the next morning that he had, but he refused to talk about it for a while. He meekly brought it up to me 2 weeks later, saying that we had had an intruder. But I could tell from the look on his face, he didn't believe anything he said, and he finally told me the truth. Even though he had his own separate experience, he still seems skeptical. I've been dealing with this for a while now, and now also with Shanice, my sister-in-law, and now I've told all of you here. I feel like I can share my stories and not feel so alone about it. I moved into my home in September of last year with my girlfriend Juliana and our son Nathan. It was a decent-sized home in a pretty good neighborhood, and it didn't take us long to move in. Juliana and I both had previous furniture from our separate apartments, and everything else we would buy when it was needed. Juliana had gone a day ahead of me with Nathan, and I drove the moving truck down. A couple of neighbors came out to chat, and some even offered to help us move in. I was pretty shocked at how neighborly everyone was. Once we had moved all the boxes in, we ate, and by that time, Nathan was worn out. Juliana went to put him to bed, and slowly after fell asleep. I was the only one up for a while, watching TV. I had the volume low to not wake up everyone. You know when you're up alone at night and your mind starts to wander? My mind went to our financial situation, which wasn't the best. I worried for Nathan starting his new school and Juliana finding work. Just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard a low humming. It was very faint, and I thought it was one of our neighbors outside, since the houses were pretty close together. I wound up falling asleep a couple minutes later. I woke up to Juliana getting Nathan ready for his first day of school. He was already dressed and eating. I got up and gave him a kiss, and he told me he didn't want to go to school and that he was scared. I tried reassuring him to the best of my ability when Juliana told him to hurry and brush his teeth. While Nathan was in the bathroom, Juliana rushed out the house loading the car, looking pretty stressed. So, trying to lighten the load, I started washing the dishes. As I was gathering them together, I heard the low humming again. I stopped and listened. This time, it was much clearer. I looked around outside and didn't see anyone. Confused, I went to check on Nathan, who had just finished brushing his teeth. He flashed me a big smile and ran past me, hollering that he loved me. I followed them out to the door and watched them leave. I started tidying the house. Once I was done, I sat down and started replying to emails. Juliana got home about 40 minutes later, and she went to take a shower. She came out a couple minutes later, laughing and saying that what I left on the bathroom mirror was adorable. I stopped and looked over at her, telling her I hadn't moved. I followed her in the bathroom and saw in the mirror a smiley face. Confused, not knowing if she was joking or not, I asked if she did it, but she insisted she didn't. As dinner time rolled around, I was cutting veggies up when I heard the humming again, but noticed it was coming from Juliana, who had just walked into the kitchen. The weekend came, and I took Nathan to the park to let Juliana rest. We ran around the park for an hour or two when I got a call from Juliana. She sounded scared, but also a little confused. Throughout her explanation to me, she'd laugh like she didn't even believe what she was saying. She had been in the back of our house in our room, laying on our bed. She had checked her email and had gotten rejected from a couple of jobs. Discouraged, she closed her laptop, and she told me her mind began to wander. All depressing thoughts, she said. When she heard a bunch of noise from the kitchen, a bunch of bangs and commotion. It sounded like something was running around it, knocking into everything. We didn't own an animal, and since our bedroom was in the very back of the house, directly down the hall was the kitchen and living room. My wife, frozen with fear, couldn't move. As the noise got louder, she could hear a low growl that sounded like it was moving closer to the room. This time hearing bangs against the wall as it moved slowly towards the room. My wife, still frozen, began to cry. She was terrified and still couldn't find the strength to move, when all at once she heard the humming, directly in the doorway. The closer the noise got to the room, the louder the humming. It was soft but loud. Under the humming, she could hear a faint talking, but couldn't make out what was being said. And all at once, the noises stopped. All of them. She sat stunned for a second, and then made her way to the kitchen. Everything was in its proper place. Freaked out, she ran out the house to call me. When I got home, we talked about it further. Juliana admitting that on a separate occasion she heard a faint humming the first night that she was there with Nathan. I was still driving down, and she worried about me getting there safely. And shortly after, she heard the humming. Throughout our years now living in this house, in times of hardship or sadness, the humming starts. It stays, I feel, long enough to give us comfort, and then it stops. Whatever it is, it has become a welcome spirit in our home.